fortunate to have a wonderful presentation for the TN Srinivasan lecture. I'm going to turn to Surjit Bhalla to give you some background on this lecture and to welcome our guests.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I think it's a real honor to introduce the TN Srinivasan lecture. TN, as all of us knew, there isn't a single economist, certainly of my generation, who hasn't been profoundly influenced by TN, by his company, by his sense of humor, and his contributions to economics. I will just relate at a personal level two of the two events or two papers that led me into the admiration for TN as a guide, as a mentor, and as a profound scholar. So this was in 1980, and if you recall, at that time, and both these things have to do with poverty, as it were. In 1980, it was quite the fashion for World Bank economists and others, but especially led by World Bank economists, friends of mine, who said that, look, the way to identify a poor person is by looking at what they eat. Not looking at what they eat and the value of what they eat, but the calories they consume. And I was working for the World Development Report at that time, trying to debunk this, and TN said, go and look at Sukhatmi's paper, and which had a big influence. And I think, I'm happy to say, 20, 30 years later, the World Bank gave up on calories as a measure. The second, again, this is at a very personal level, but this is how he influenced, mentored, and he's been, one of the things to note is that he's been at every IPF, but his reach goes well beyond IPF. I mean, and I think he will be and is considered one of the greatest economists of his generation. But the second one had to do with for his book that he and Pranab Bardhan were coming out with on rural poverty in South Asia, and asked me, I don't know how it originated, to write a chapter for that book. And is Sri Lanka an exception, which is why is Sri Lanka considered to be such a great performer, was a paper that I wrote and which TN had a heavy influence on. So I'm really, he inspired me, he basically guided me in all of this, as is done to several other individuals. One of the notes in which I think has been passed out to people about the past participants in the lecture is that his obsession with data and its quality, and this is something was another big factor in my admiration of TN. Finally, on this, Sonaldi will introduce our guest, but I have a question for you before we proceed. You worked a lot on poverty, which is on India also, as well as poverty worldwide. And my question is, from your experience and study, is there any other country in the world where poverty, irrespective of data, is such an emotive issue? So in other words, it's in the newspapers every day, every second day, what's happened to poverty. There are more poverty estimates than there are people in India or economists. So any other country where this is the case, please enlighten us. Thanks.
It's a very,
Oh, no, you answer after each.
Please,
Okay, I don't want to.
yeah.
Well, I think Surjit couldn't have asked this question to a better person because one of the things I most admire about our speaker, Peter Lanjouw, is that he has both theoretical, empirical, and methodological work around poverty. So the combination of the three is just fantastic. Pete is currently a professor of development economics at Vrije University in Amsterdam. His work has been very much on poverty and inequality. Tremendous amount of work on India, but also on other countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and so on. He is, if memory serves, you were part of the 2006 WDR report on equity. Yeah. And he is currently the director of the Luxembourg income study, so which is something that really is quite a path-breaking effort in bringing together data from different parts of the world. So thank you, welcome, and we are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much for this. I'd like to start also by thanking very much NCAER for inviting me to give this this presentation, and I feel honored but also quite humbled to be giving this presentation in honor of T.N. Srinivasan, who, as Surjit has just mentioned, it was a sort of real leading figure in the area of poverty and income inequality analysis here in India, alongside his huge contributions in economics more generally. For me, his book, jointly written with Pranab Bardhan in 1974 on poverty and income distribution in India, was a hugely influential study in which he, as Surjit also emphasized, really drove home the importance of data and quality, and he really established, I think that book was very important in establishing some of the sort of best practice methods of poverty analysis that are still being used today. And a reflection of this is also in the fact that that book has been recently reissued in a volume now written jointly with Abhijit Banerjee, Bardhan Sominathan, and T.N. One of the things, if I could just quickly respond to Sir Surjit's question before I move on, I do think it's a very interesting question because it's true that poverty and the whole debate around poverty is hugely important and influential here in India, and it is difficult perhaps to think of other countries where that where a similar degree of interest and attention is given to the topic. At the same time, I do remember as well that my own, one of my mentors in the analysis of inequality and poverty, Tony Atkinson, he was always really valuable in pointing to, emphasizing the importance of doing poverty analysis and thinking about its purpose and how it was really important that one of the purposes of analyzing poverty was to sort of feed into public debate and public discussion. And this was something that T.N. also actually emphasized, and I have a quote here from a paper he wrote in 1994 where he emphasized that India has one of the better statistical systems in the developing world, and what is more, there is a strong tradition of open debate and discussion on data issues, and this is something that is really valuable, I think, in a society. It's something that Tony, at the time when I was in the paper that I'm thinking of, was referring to, where he was referring to the debates in the US and the UK, where he was arguing that the existence of a poverty line in the US, which is a sort of absolute poverty line, not all that dissimilar from the kind of poverty line that's being used here in India, was actually very helpful for focusing discussion and debate in the US on poverty, and he was contrasting that with the UK, where there was less emphasis on poverty as a topic of discussion, simply because there wasn't this whole tradition of measuring poverty in the way that it was in the US with the famous poverty lines and poverty analysis that's been conducted there over the years. So this public discussion element is just very important, and having an apparatus for measuring poverty is very important to feed into that debate, and T.N. Srinivasan was clearly extremely important in influencing all of those developments. There's a question about whether and how the topic of my discussion today sort of fits into this bigger issue of poverty in a country, and that's because my focus is going to be very much in my discussion on poverty and inequality at the very, very local level. And the one thing I think I can say is that TN probably would have approved also of this particular focus. So he himself was also engaged in these questions about poverty analysis, the analysis, the measurement of welfare at the village level and so on. I was also very influenced by his contribution in the volume by Pranab Bardhan called Conversations Between Economists and Anthropologists, where he was really engaging with anthropologists also on this issue of how do we measure welfare and so on at the very local level. So I'm hopeful that this would be a topic that he would have approved of as well. Finally, I should say that I was very lucky myself to have had quite a few interactions with TN over the years, in particular during the 1990s when I went up to New Haven quite often and was able to benefit from interactions with him. And I always found him, to be very deeply insightful and very generous with his time and his enthusiasm with regard to the kind of questions and issues that I was working on. So it's a real honor for me to be allowed, to be permitted to be giving this presentation today. Okay, so what I would like to try to do today is start from a point of departure that came up in this Bardhan and Srinivasan book from 1974, which was, in that book, there's quite a lot of discussion about what was going on and what had happened to poverty in India since independence up through the 1960s. So they were taking in that book already a kind of longer term perspective on what had been the evolution of poverty and inequality in India since independence. And so I'm going to start by very quickly trying to do something a little bit similar about sort of what has been poverty, what is the situation of poverty and inequality in India sort of over the last few decades. But I'm not going to dwell too much on that, because I'm going to argue that in fact we shouldn't necessarily be focusing all our attention and all our energies on studying poverty and inequality at this aggregate level of looking at the level of a country and sort of tracking what's been happening to poverty over time at the level of a country as large as India. And that we should actually be looking at the subnational picture, and we should really be drilling down to a very local level. So I'll try to defend that position when I'm moving on from the original discussion. And then I'll take that to the real core of what I would hope to be able to cover today, which is to actually spend a little bit of time thinking about poverty and inequality and its evolution over decades at the village level, looking at what's been going on at the village level. Now, of course, India has, I think something like 500,000 villages, and so obviously I'm not going to be talking about all villages in India. I'm going to be focusing on two villages. One village that I've been heavily involved in working on myself, jointly with my co-author Himanshu, Nick Stern, Jean Drez, and many others, which is called Palanpur in the state of Uttar Pradesh. And then I'll also refer more briefly to a recent study that I was associated with, jointly with Satisha Banur, on a village in Karnataka called Alabujanahalli. And we'll try to present a picture of what's been happening there, including up to and through the COVID-19 impacts. Okay, so what's been happening to poverty in India across recent decades? And so there is actually quite a nice series that we can follow in terms of poverty from, say, the late 1980s, or even as early as 1983, using the consumption and expenditure surveys that are available in India, and tracking poverty all the way through to around 2011, 2012. And what we see is actually a very encouraging picture of steadily declining poverty, which really accelerated then during the periods after the turn of the century. Around 2004, poverty decline really started accelerating, and in particular, there seems to have been a particularly rapid decline in poverty between 2009 and 2011-12. So, but a very, very encouraging picture of poverty decline through those decades from the 80s through to 2011, 2012. With respect to inequality, it's less of a trend. There was a significant decline or a significant increase in inequality between the 1990s and the early 2000s. Since the 2004 round of the CES survey, there hasn't been as clear of a trend. So the 2000s didn't see a clear trend, but it was at a higher level. So an increase in inequality and a decline in poverty is sort of the picture that emerges from this analysis. Since 2011, 2012, I really don't think I need to belabor this, but it's been much less clear as what has happened to poverty, because the unit record level data for the 2017-18 round hasn't been released. There were some tabulations that were apparently leaked, suggesting that poverty had increased, but those figures have never been officially endorsed. The CES data have been suggested are problematic and cannot really be used. They have not been released in any case. And so there's been a huge number of studies and investigations that have been carried out to try to establish what has happened to poverty since 2011-12. It's a debate. Some point to declining poverty, some studies point to increasing poverty, and so it's somewhat of an unclear picture as things stand at the moment. It's interesting that the World Bank, which has a mandate or an imperative to sort of produce global poverty numbers, has felt really in a bind here, because India contributes in a very significant way to global poverty, and the absence of hard data on what's been happening in India is then obviously also affecting the ability of the World Bank to produce estimates of global poverty. And so they've put a lot of effort into trying to estimate poverty trends post 2011-12, and there's a study by Roy and van der Weijden who actually produced estimates that have now been sort of adopted by the World Bank, suggesting that there has been a decline, a kind of slow but steady continued decline of poverty through to just when the COVID pandemic hit. Those numbers themselves have not gone unquestioned. There's a recent paper by Drez and Somanchi suggesting that the methods used by the Roy and van der Weijden paper aren't completely convincing. As a result, we're basically in a situation where the debate still continues. And so there isn't a whole lot that we can say to sort of bring the poverty story up to date beyond the 2011-2012 data, for which we can claim that there's going to be a broad consensus. I think that's the basic point, and that debate will likely continue. But as I say, that's really not the focus of this presentation. I would like to try to bring everybody along and try to convince you that it's important to look at the very local level. And I'd like to start by referring to what I thought was a very interesting paper. As far as I know, it's never been published, but it's a very interesting paper by Bill Easterly and his colleagues. And it's called The Long History of a Short Block, where he basically analyzes a block in New York City. And he covers the economic development in that block for over a period of 400 years. And he documents that they document in this paper that in these 400 years, this little block of real estate in what's now New York City has undergone dramatic changes. The first 200 years, it was largely agricultural. There wasn't a New York City. The activities that took place in that block were basically agricultural activities. But then the slowly growing New York City started absorbed this particular area. And economic activities changed as a result. And what we see since the early 1800s in this block is a dramatic set of activities and changes in the composition and the sort of role of this particular block. There is activities. It started off in the early 1800s with small crafts and miscellaneous activities. Kind of inglorious period in this block was when it became a sort of hotbed of prostitution and sort of depraved activities. Then they ceded onto a period of time when there was garment manufacturing and tailoring going on in that little block, and then that ceded to a period of printing and paper production, and then that ceded to kind of decline again, where it became sort of vacant buildings that were occupied by artists and squatters who then sort of resided in that block area. And then those artists and squatters sort of gave way to extremely wealthy apartments and luxury stores. And it's basically a block in Soho, New York City now, where the real estate prices are the highest in all of Manhattan, apparently. And so what they emphasize is that in this block of one very small area, there's been an enormous heterogeneity and varying sort of story of economic development in that block. And what they emphasize is that it would have been extremely difficult to predict what was going to happen in that village, because the kind of factors that influenced what happened in that block were sort of outside factors, and how they influenced development in that block were very different from how they influenced neighboring blocks. And so it was extremely idiosyncratic, the development story of that particular block. And that's something I would like to try to emphasize with this need to look at what's going on at the very local level. Now, how do we understand what's going on at the local level in a country like India? It's very difficult. We rely on survey data such as the CES consumption survey, which is nationally representative, which can be disaggregated down to the state level. It even allows disaggregation down to the NSS region level, which are agroclimatic zones, but doesn't really allow for disaggregation beyond that. And of course, these regions are still huge with many, many millions of people residing in them. So we're not really able to use these conventional survey data to drill down and capture what's going on at the very local level. So there has been research over the years that I've been involved in. Sonalde referred to some sort of methodological work that I was involved in, and I was involved in the early 2000s in sort of developing approaches to try to estimate poverty and inequality outcomes at the very local level by combining household survey and population census data and using sort of imputation methods to try to combine the strengths of the survey data with the very large coverage of the household of the population census data. It does involve working with these data at the unit record level, so it's quite an ambitious exercise, and particularly a rather unprecedented exercise for statistical agencies to release census data at this very, very detailed unit record level. That was the sort of methodology to develop the combined censuses and survey data. There's been ongoing research in that area since then, and there's been growing awareness or familiarity also and experience with producing these small area estimates of poverty and inequality using a combination of household surveys and sort of satellite remote sensing data. So it doesn't necessarily always require population census data. So there are methods that have been developing over the years that do allow us to potentially look at what's going on at the very local level. And in fact, I was involved in a pilot study along with Subhashish Gangopadhyay, Tara Vishwanath, and Nobuo Yoshida when I was still working at the World Bank, where we did a sort of pilot exercise of looking at what's happening to poverty, what is the poverty situation in 3 states of India. And I have 3 slides that kind of just really quickly capture what we're talking about here. So here we have the slide for Andhra Pradesh, where the state level poverty rate in Andhra Pradesh is about 10.5%. This is based on the population census of 2001 and the household survey from 2004 or 5. On aggregate in Andhra Pradesh, the poverty rate was 10.5%. At the district level, you can see that there's quite a lot of variation. And when you go down to the tehsil level, the block level, you can see that there's enormous heterogeneity. A similar picture arises when we look at Orissa, where the state level poverty rate is 46.9% in 2004-05. And then we see this enormous heterogeneity in Odisha. West Bengal, we have a very similar picture again. There's a lot of heterogeneity at the very, very local level. This is kind of consistent with this idea that these tehsils, which already are more aggregate than the villages, but even at the tehsil level, there's very different development experience that's going on. And what we see, there's pockets of affluence and there's pockets of poverty. In each of these states, there's some tehsils that have poverty rates in excess of 60%. And we have poverty in other tehsils, poverty rates below 15%, all in a state that has a sort of aggregate poverty rate of, say, 10% or 40% or so on. We have similar variation if we look at inequality maps. And there's also some interesting patterns that we observe where poverty and inequality, how they correlate with each other. Turns out that in Andhra Pradesh, it seems that the poorest tehsils are also ones that are rather unequal. Whereas in West Bengal and Odisha, the poorest tehsils are also relatively homogeneous. There's relatively low income inequality in the poorest tehsils. And that has interesting implications also for the design of policy, targeting, for example, and the possibility of things like elite capture occurring, potentially a bigger risk in a state like Andhra Pradesh than, say, in West Bengal. The question is, could we produce maps like this, and could we be tracking poverty and distributional outcomes at this very local level in a country like India? And I do think that it is feasible, but it does require obviously leveraging the kind of data that at the moment are not being leveraged for this purpose. Another entry point in this discussion is some work that was recently done by Abhirup Mukhopadhyay and David Garces-Urzainki, where they look at inequality in India, and they introduce a kind of method whereby they can decompose inequality at the all India level, and they ask how much of total inequality that we observe in India actually is due to inequality that occurs within villages. So they decompose inequality between villages, between districts, between states, and they can see what the contribution is of inequality at these different levels of aggregation. Their paper suggests that something like 70, at the all India level, if you combine both rural and urban areas, 70% of inequality is actually inequality that occurs at the village level. In rural areas, it's 75%. In urban areas, it's as high as 88%. And this is in 2004. And there's no sense of that having declined between 2004 and 2011. So again, outcomes are really heterogeneous, and they are very heterogeneous already at the very local level. They're not, it's not a matter of one village being poor and another village, everybody being rich. No, you have a lot of heterogeneity that occurs within villages. Most of the inequality in India, if you were to equalize the incomes of all villages so that on average every village had the same average income, you would reduce inequality in India as a whole only by a very small amount. Most of the inequality would remain because it arises within villages. So this is by means of motivating my interest in trying to present some analysis of inequality and poverty, and to try to trace some of the currents that we aren't able to typically detect that might be at work at the village level rather than sort of at the national level. And so what I'll start is by discussing the village of Palanpur in Uttar Pradesh, in Moradabad district, Uttar Pradesh, for which we've been tracking living standards, the functioning of the economy, a very broad range of indicators of evidence on the economy of Palanpur since the 1950s. And then I'll turn also to some remarks about Alabujanahalli in the state of Karnataka, in Mandya district in Karnataka. A distinctive feature of both of these village studies is that they are longitudinal village studies. They cover, they track change, evolution over time, but they're also covering the entire population of the village. So it's not a sample of households in the village that we're able to collect data on. We've actually been collecting data on the entire population of the village. And that's quite helpful when we're trying to think about things like inequality, because we need to have a really good capture, a good representation of the village population in order to be able to say something with confidence about what's going on about inequality. A feature of both of these villages, and I can't claim that this is that this is happening in every village of India, but I have a feeling that it's likely to be in some form or other working at play in all villages in India, is this process of structural transformation, which is a combination of both agricultural intensification as well as non-farm diversification. So both agricultural is becoming more intensive, more market-oriented, with a focus on raising yields and so on. But at the same time, the economy of these villages are also evolving away from just a pure reliance on agriculture to also an interaction with the wider world and an engagement with the non-agricultural economy as well. And I'll use these two village studies where recent data has been collected to also say a few words about what has been the impact of COVID and how did that play out at this very local level in these two villages. So Palanpur is a village in Moradabad district, as I mentioned. It's mainly an agricultural village with smallholders. It's got a diverse caste structure. Caste is something that we haven't really focused on that much in the discussion so far, but I think when you're trying to look at what's happening in a village, it really is important to look at the caste structure of the villages, because the experience of different castes does turn out to be quite different with respect to this process of structural transformation. The Palanpur has been studied and surveyed in a very intensive way 7 times in each decade since independence, so starting in the late 1950s. The village was chosen by Nick Stern and Christopher Bliss in 1974-75, and this documented, the economy of that village was documented in great detail by them in a volume that came out in 1982, and drawing mainly on the data that they themselves had collected in 1974-75. And they had chosen Palanpur because it had been studied earlier by the Agricultural Economics Research Center as part of Delhi University in both 1957 and 1962. So the village had been studied previously, which is why they chose Palanpur. They wanted to live separately from the village, because they did end up living nearly a year in the village in order to be able to collect the data that they were collecting. It was located about 250 kilometers away from Delhi, so it wasn't too far, but at the same time it wasn't too close to be contaminated in some sense by the economy of Delhi. Wheat and tenancy were very important. Wheat cultivation and tenancy were important aspects of the village economy, something that interested them a lot in the 1970s when they were interested in looking at the impact of the Green Revolution. Again, you can't generalize on the basis of a village like Palanpur, but at the same time, there was nothing that jumps out as being particularly atypical about a village like Palanpur, and certainly not at the time when it was selected. One of the important things to bear in mind when one is comparing living standards across the different survey years is that some years are good agricultural years, some years are bad agricultural years, and that has an impact on incomes and on distribution, and it needs to be taken into account when thinking about longer-term trends in what's been going on. The village is located here in Moradabad district. I think my little dot has moved. Should be a little bit to the left there. It's in Moradabad district. I apologize for that. Most recently, Himanshu, Nick Stern, and I put together the results from our analysis of data up through 2008, 2009, with some observations also from a 2015 survey, and we've summarized or sort of put together as much as we could from all those studies in this book that was published in 2018. So for those of you who are really interested, there's lots and lots of details that I will not be touching on today to be found there. So the village is a small village it was 500 people who were living in the village in 1957. By 2015, that had climbed to 1,200, 1,300 inhabitants in the village. I'll say some more about the most recent data for Palanpur based on our rather quick resurvey in 2022 in a few moments. The average growth of the population has been more or less the same as the all India average. Migration has been a factor at play, but it hasn't really been a major factor. In the more recent years, it seems to be picking up, and so it might become something of greater importance to take into account in the more recent years. But in the earlier years, the out-migration from the village was really very, very minimal. As I mentioned, caste is an important element of a village community, of a village society. And in Palanpur, there's 3 castes that are of particular importance and that will come up again in the analysis. At the very top of the village hierarchy is a caste known as the Thakurs, which is a kind of a martial caste. They represented 302 members of the village population in 2015. Below them in sort of ranking in terms of sort of the society, the way the community sees the ranking, are the Muraos, which was a traditional cultivating caste. And they were a caste that really took advantage of the Green Revolution when it was really coming on strong in the village trajectory. And then there's a Jatab caste, which is at the sort of very bottom of the village hierarchy, which is a scheduled caste community, and they've been in the village for a very long time and have had quite different experience of economic development than the other 2 major castes. And then, as you can see, there's also a set of additional caste groupings. It's important to document as well, to emphasize that there are within this caste structure, actually probably not strictly correct to call them castes, but there's these 2 groups, the Dobis and the Telis, who are actually Muslim. So it's a village that comprises both a Muslim and a Hindu population. The major crop, as I mentioned, was wheat, and that was why it was selected by Bliss and Stern as for detailed study in 1974-75. And what you can see is that yields in this village have really dramatically improved. Martin Wolf was mentioning yesterday in conversation about the Green Revolution and its impact, and you can really see that in this village. The yields in 1957 and 1962 were, 0.4 of a quintal per biga. That had risen to 2.9 by 2008-2009. The similar improvements were observed in these other crops that are grown in the village. It's important to emphasize that there's really 2 episodes of green revolution that occurred in Palanpur. In the period between late 1950s and say the mid 1970s, green revolution was to a very large extent influenced by the spread of irrigation. When the village was surveyed in the 1950s, less than half of the village land was irrigated. By 1974-75, all of the land was irrigated. And this expansion of irrigation is kind of a land augmenting technological change, and it was a hugely important influence on the rising yields. Of course, high yield varieties, particularly of the wheat, were a big part of the story as well. Fertilizers were a part of the story, not to understate their importance. But then after 1970, starting in the 1970s and continuing thereafter, the technological change and the green revolution was more in the form of mechanization. Tractors have become heavily used. There's all kinds of tools now. The use of buffaloes has declined in terms of land preparation and so on. So we have a sort of land augmenting technological change, and then a labor displacing process of technological change that has been at play in terms of agriculture in the village. But as I mentioned, the structural transformation process in Palanpur has been a combination of agricultural intensification and non-farm diversification. And what you can see here is that the non-farm composition of the workforce has steadily improved and grown over time. It's actually interesting to note there's a small decline there between 1983 and 1993 before it then resumed by 2008, 2009. And that's exactly the kind of idiosyncratic event that that the New York City block story was also emphasizing. A particular factory that had been employing quite a few villagers in the 1983-84 survey was no longer in operation by the 1993 survey. So there was you could see that in the data. There was less employment in the non-agricultural sector. But by 2008, 2009, new developments had occurred in the vicinity of Palanpur, and employment opportunities were found again. Income shares in Palanpur also tell this story. By 2008-2009, 60% of the village income was coming from non-agricultural, non-cultivation sources, down from, whereas in 1957-58 it was 60% agriculture, cultivation income. And if you add livestock income to that on top of it, you can see how the agricultural economy was just overwhelmingly dominant at the time the survey period started, and how the non-agricultural sector had become extremely important by the 2008-2009. Interesting, if you look within the different sources of non-agricultural income, it's really self-employment that has become extremely important. Regular job, sort of salaried employment has also been important throughout, but it seems to be showing some decline. And of course, sort of casual wage employment has been reasonably stable over this time period. Or actually it's been reasonably stable over this time period. What has happened to poverty after all this is our interest was in? Well, what we saw is that poverty has declined dramatically alongside this process of agricultural intensification and non-farm diversification. Poverty, in Palanpur, we've been measuring income as our main source a main indicator of economic welfare. And it's a measure of income that we've tried to be extremely careful with. So most of the data collection that's taken place in Palanpur has involved living in the village for very long periods of time. So there's a lot of verification, a lot of validation, a lot of double checking of what's going on in terms of input use, in terms of harvests, and so on. So the income data is what we believe is to be our best indicator of economic well-being. But we did also collect consumption data in 1957, 62, and again in 2008, 2009. None of these measures of income or consumption can be compared to NSS, CES consumption, or the IHDS income measure and so on. The underlying methods for constructing these measures are entirely different. But what we can document quite clearly is a very steady decline in poverty leading up to 2008, 2009. Now, I had mentioned that we had collected data also in 2015 and then again in 2022. Our income data are not as complete for those years, and so I'm not reporting poverty measures based on income, that's a kind of a comparable income for those later years. So our best measure and the most up-to-date measure of poverty based on our best the best practice income measure is this 38.3% in 2008-2009. Inequality has seen no real trend other than that by 2008-2009 it seems to be particularly considerably higher than it was in the earlier years. So there seems to be some suggestion that between 1983 and 2008-2009 there was this upkick in inequality in a similar way to what I had described had been observed at the all India level as well. So maybe alongside this non-farm diversification process we've also seen an increase in inequality. So what I'd like to try to do now is just very quickly touch on a few sort of studies that have been carried out. We're trying to sort of unpack or look a little bit more closely at some of these trends that have taken place in Palanpur. And one of the first questions that we wanted to ask is this question of, is it really the non-farm diversification process that has led to this increase in inequality in the village? So we conducted some counterfactual sort of simulations of what the economy of Palanpur would have looked like if it had remained a very largely agricultural village as it was in 1957 or 1962. And our simulations suggest that in fact it's quite conceivable that a village that had remained entirely agricultural or very largely agricultural would have seen an even larger increase in inequality. That this non-farm diversification process, although it's associated with this rising inequality, may actually have been helping to contain inequality from rising even further. This makes some intuitive sense because what we know is that the village population has been growing, the village land is fixed, and so per capita land holdings have been declining. We also have observed in Palanpur over the years an increase in the incidence of what's known as reverse tenancy, where small farmers, small landowners are leasing out their land to larger landowners. So that would be consistent with the possibility, at least, of rising inequality if agriculture had remained the main source of income, the main source of economic living standards. So that's one observation, that people often talk about this diversification process as potentially good for poverty reduction, good for economic growth, but potentially bad for inequality. And it may well be the case, but there's also the possibility, at least, that this non-farm diversification process is also playing a benign impact on the distribution of income as a whole. A second piece of analysis that we did was this question of zeroing in on this issue of caste differences to sort of explore the experience of economic development over time in Palanpur for these different caste groups. And one of the things that we found when we were looking at the experience of economic development in Palanpur up through to around 1983-84 was this rather disturbing observation that this one particular group of scheduled castes, the Jatabs, were falling further and further behind from the rest of the village. And in fact, the distribution of income in the village as a whole was becoming more and more like it was fully partitioned, where the richest Jatab was still poorer than the poorest non-Jatab household in the village. It didn't fully become partitioned. It wasn't like it was all fully partitioned, but it was moving in that direction over time. The Jatabs were just falling behind. They weren't participating as much in this non-agricultural sector. They weren't finding employment in these non-farm jobs, and they were working as agricultural laborers. The rest of the village was moving on with both agricultural intensification and non-farm diversification taking place. When we then updated the analysis again in 2008-2009, we found that gap had reversed, and so this partitioning process that we had noted and that we were somewhat alarmed by had kind of reversed, and there was a return more or less to the fold of this Jatab community, implying that at least some of the households in the Jatab community were actually able to branch out and find employment in the non-agricultural sector, see their incomes rise, and so on. Another question that's been of interest to us is to sort of, given the fact that we have these longitudinal data where we're able to track households over generations and actual individual households, the entire village population over time, is to sort of ask questions about mobility. And unsurprisingly, sort of as we had expected, the expansion of non-farm opportunities, the rise in agricultural incomes was associated with an increase in intra-generational mobility. So if we just compare mobility from one survey year to the next and across the adjacent survey years, we see that mobility has increased. There's fewer and fewer people that were so stuck in the quintiles of their preceding survey year as we track these survey years over time. So mobility seems to have been improving. But then interestingly, if we try to look at intergenerational mobility, and the Palanpur data set really is quite unique in that we're allowed to we can track generational changes, because we go back to the 1950s, and we can actually ask, what is the intergenerational mobility, say, between 1957 and 1974, a 25-year period, roughly one generation, and then again from 1974 through to 2008, again another generation. What do we see in terms of intergenerational mobility? We see that alongside this process of intragenerational mobility improvements, we see intergenerational mobility actually declining. The elasticity of income across generations is actually increased, suggesting that the son's income you can predict the son's income better with the father's income now than you could between 1957 and 1974-75. And that's kind of, if we kind of correlate that with the fact that inequality has also increased over time, we have what we can sort of find some kind of support for what's been popularized as the Great Gatsby curve in the work by Miles Korak and others, suggesting that higher inequality is often associated with lower intergenerational mobility. This higher elasticity across between generations is an indicator of lower intergenerational mobility. So over time, there seems to have been some suggestion that while there's been lots of change and lots of sort of turbulence in the village economy, it's not the case that this has completely overthrown the hierarchies that existed in the past. And in fact, you're better able to predict where a person is today looking at the previous generation than you could earlier on. We're curious, and we will hopefully be continuing with this study, so we're very curious to see whether this kind of process continues as we go forward. Turning now to COVID, what has been the impact of COVID? Well, the first thing is it turns out there were very few reported cases of COVID in the village altogether, but at the same time we also acknowledge that that's very likely to be because there's underreporting, and villagers didn't really want to have to go into sort of quarantine and so on, so they tended to not report falling ill or anything like that, and they treated the illnesses with their own remedies, and so we have very few recorded cases of COVID. We also observe a very significant return of villagers who had left the village and migrated out, returning back to Palanpur as a result of the COVID pandemic. So this is very much confirming from the village side what people had been reporting on sort of at the All India side of large numbers of workers leaving the urban areas and returning back to their villages. And we find that in Palanpur, indeed, the same thing had happened. A very important aspect that we observed in Palanpur is that with the COVID lockdowns and with all the restrictions, the education provision in the village, whatever education provision was there, which I have to say has never been particularly impressive, but that schooling provision and sort of education services completely collapsed in the village. And so there was just a loss of education. There was very little opportunities for online education. The schools were closed, so the kids basically did not go to school for that entire period. And there will be obviously long-term consequences potentially from that. And then there was a very significant employment effects. So if you look at the pre-COVID picture, it looked as though a very large percentage of the villagers were employed outside of agriculture. That declined dramatically during the lockdowns, with agriculture picking up the slack, a big return to cultivation and so on. And then post-lockdown, the non-farm employment had resumed, although it hadn't yet, by the time when we did our resurvey in 2022, hadn't returned to the sort of the pre-COVID levels. These are the kind of impacts that we get based on the reports from the households. Loss of jobs were very significant. Savings were very heavily drawn down. Poverty, our estimate is that it has increased. The poverty rate that's reported here is 42%, but it's not comparable at all with the poverty rates that I reported earlier. It's based on an entirely different measure of income, and in fact the poverty line that we're using in this particular calculation is also not the same. So I should probably not have reported this particular poverty rate. But it does seem, based on all kinds of other indicators, that poverty has living standards were directly and very badly affected by the COVID experience. One interesting observation is that in Palanpur, the publicly provided interventions and relief did actually have an impact, and were definitely received, and that's an encouraging sign. 76 of the village households did report receiving some kind of COVID relief. The free rations were very widely cited and welcomed by the villagers. PDS households did receive PDS foods, and a fair amount of employment under the MNREGA was provided, and households were able to avail of those types of relief policies. I want to turn now quickly, if I still have some time, to the Alabujanahalli study, which is a village in Mandya district in Karnataka. It's in the Calvary Delta, and it's a very interesting village because it's located in the same district that Scarlett Epstein, a very famous anthropologist who had worked on 2 villages in that region in the 1950s and 60s, and published a very interesting set of books about those villages. And what was really interesting in her study is that she compared 2 villages that one had been affected by canal irrigation and had been able to acquire access to irrigation waters as a result of this canal that had been dug, and its neighboring village was located somewhat higher altitude. It wasn't able to get the irrigation waters and had to develop along a very different trajectory. These 2 villages are located in the same village as Alabujanahalli. This is a study that was carried out by Satisha Banur, who just recently completed his PhD and was visiting at Amsterdam a few years ago, where we started this work. Now he undertook a census survey, so covering all households in the village in 2018-2019, and he was building on a previous census survey that had been carried out by the Foundation for Agrarian Studies in 2008-2009. This village is also a largely smallholder village, with cultivation and farming playing a much more important role in the economy of the village than what we see present day in Palanpur. Sugarcane is the main crop that's grown there. They rely on migrant labor for harvesting and land preparation to a much, much greater extent than what we see in Palanpur, where that isn't common at all. It also has a caste structure where a particular caste, the Vocaliga caste of cultivators, is a heavily dominant group in the village. And the small group of SCs called the Adi Karnataka, traditionally drum-beating caste, represents about 11% of the village population. Not all that different from Palanpur. Is 243 households in 2008, 261 in 2018. As I mentioned, agriculture and allied activities were the main economic activities, but there was also a fair amount of employment outside the village. Interestingly, unlike in Palanpur, much of the non-farm employment for the Alabujanahalli residents is sort of regular employment. That's probably likely due to the fact that they're located to a town that's only about 1.5 kilometers away. They're also only 95 kilometers away from Bangalore, so perhaps greater access to some of these more desirable regular jobs than was possible for Palanpur households. The village also saw an expansion of non-farm employment, but to a much lower degree than in Palanpur. So between 2008 and 2018, non-farm employment increased from about 20% to 33% of total employment. Most of it, as I mentioned, is regular employment. Education seems to have played a really important role there. You had to be educated to get these regular non-farm jobs. The SCs in Alabujanahalli were able to participate in that because they also had benefited from improved education to a much greater extent possibly than what we have seen in Palanpur, where education does not seem to have had as important a role to play in helping to secure these non-agricultural jobs. Agriculture has also been intensifying in Alabujanahalli. There's a big shift to higher value sugarcane, rising yields, but in Alabujanahalli, in this district, and I have to confess I don't know enough about this district to comment more on it, but it seems as though in this part of Karnataka, cultivation costs were really rising sharply, and that actually put a lot of pressure on real incomes, despite the fact that yields had been rising. What we see in Alabujanahalli is an interesting phenomenon of sort of rising real income between 2008 and 2009, accompanied by falling inequality and rising poverty. This is not the usual pattern that we typically see. And it's, again, kind of a testimony to this point that the village-specific circumstances seem to be quite important in terms of understanding what we observe about trends in poverty and inequality. A possible explanation is that what we do know, what we can document, is that the SCs had been quite successful between 2008 and 2018 in securing non-agricultural jobs. They had historically been very much at the lower end of the distribution of income. Many of them had been able to get non-farm jobs. Perhaps affirmative action had played a role there, I'm not sure, but they were able to get non-farm jobs. At the same time, a lot of the cultivating households who are reliant more heavily on cultivation saw their real incomes under pressure, with a non-negligible number of them seeing actually declines in their income. So despite the fact that average income in the village as a whole had increased, within the village there were also households who had seen falling agricultural incomes, and so some saw their poverty rise. And then the fact that we have the SCs improving, seeing falling poverty of the SCs, and we have some new households falling into poverty, but we have an overall compression of income due to the poor real income increase. We have the possibility of a decline in inequality at the same time. So these processes are possible, at least in principle. It's hard to be able to document them exactly and to verify that the story is the full story. This is a table that just documents essentially what I've just said with the rising incomes between 2008 and 2018, but then a very dramatic declines between 2018 and 2021 when the last round of data collection took place. So the COVID had a huge impact on Alabujanahalli as well, and incomes dropped dramatically. We saw a poverty impact of in Alabujanahalli extending through to the COVID period, where poverty had increased slightly between 2008 and 2018, but then increased dramatically in the sort of midst of the COVID pandemic. Where things stand today, we don't have the income data on it, but we do know that a lot of the employment has that people whose jobs had been lost had been able to return back to work. So likely the poverty rate is well below that 83% again today. In Alabujanahalli as well, just as in Palanpur, public relief did actually play a huge role. It was extremely helpful in providing support to the households in this rural village. Very similar pattern to Palanpur, with the possible noteworthy aspect that the MNREGA program was not terribly successful in Alabujanahalli in terms of providing employment. The argument there is that because the villagers, the farmers, were reliant on migrant labor typically, and with the lockdowns, migrant labor was no longer able to come to the village. They were very keen to have the local laborers work on the farms, and so they lobbied to prevent the MNREGA projects from being implemented, so that there would be a labor available to work on the fields during the COVID period. So let me sort of end with just some observations that I think might be useful to take away from this discussion here. The first point that I would simply make is that I do think it's really important, given the likelihood of enormous heterogeneity in what happens at the local level across localities. It's just important to try to collect and track changes at the very local level. I think this is particularly important if we see the rural economy continue diversifying away out of agriculture. Just as we saw in that study of the New York City block, once the non-agricultural economies started really making themselves heard, you saw that the volatility of what happens in the village economy it really accelerates. And I think that that's something that we should also note here. As the rural economy becomes more diversified, we should expect more idiosyncratic development trajectories at the level of the village and at the level of the tehsil and so on. And so we should spend, we should try to do what we can to track and understand what's going on at the local level. There are these methods that are available that could help shed light on some of these trends and trajectories, and I think to the extent that there's an interest that it would be worth pursuing some of those. I think with respect to structural transformation, we should recognize that it is, at least in these two villages, underway, and I would have thought likely to be underway more broadly in rural India. We have both land augmenting as well as land displacing, labor displacing technological change, and the consequences for poverty and inequality will be extremely different depending on those different types of technological change. The COVID experience has taught us that this agriculture continues to play a very important fallback position. So I think rural households today in Palanpur and in Alabujanahalli are much more convinced of the interest of keeping at least one foot in agriculture, even though they are definitely all looking for non-agricultural opportunities, but to keep some association with cultivation because they see that when you have an employment shock, as COVID was to a considerable extent, you can see that that's then really important to be able to return to cultivation to help compensate. A point that's very important, perhaps I haven't mentioned it yet, but something that's really important in both Alabujanahalli as well as in Palanpur is that this non-farm diversification process is a process that involves a lot of commuting. It's not necessarily a process where people leave the rural areas to move to urban areas, you know, a la sort of classic Lewis model or something. But what we see is that a lot of people continue to reside in their village, but then work outside the village and commute on a daily basis or on a very high frequency, regular basis. And that's important, I think, because it allows villagers to diversify their income sources. They can use these non-agricultural incomes that they generate to also help finance agricultural activities, potentially choose alternative cropping patterns and so on. So this interplay between agriculture and non-agriculture, I think, is really important, and is facilitated by the fact that employment is often occurring sort of on a commuting basis. As the non-farm sector expands, even if we see currently that many of the non-poor are those who are best placed to get the more desirable non-farm jobs, if the non-farm sector continues to expand, I think there's good reason to think that its incidence, the degree to which the poor will be able to benefit from non-agricultural opportunities will improve. We saw that a little bit in this case, in this discussion that I made of the Jatab community in Palanpur, first falling behind and then being able to catch up again. Because the non-farm sector just continued to expand, it just made it possible for these poorer households to then also avail of the opportunities that had become available. And then, as I mentioned as well, through this counterfactual simulation exercise, whether or not the non-farm sector is a good or a bad thing for inequality, I think is an open question. It's likely to vary again with the specific conditions and circumstances of the individual village. But I don't think, a real reason to suspect that it's inevitably going to be associated with rising inequality in all villages. When you have greater complexity and diversity of a village economy, so as this non-farm diversification process expands, I think we're also going to see mobility increasing. The economies are going to change more. You're going to see people climbing and other people falling, but there's no reason to think necessarily, or there's no assurance that this is going to fundamentally alter the underlying hierarchy and structure of the village society. At least we saw in Palanpur that there's reasons to think that the fundamental sort of structure of the village society has actually been able to continue despite all these significant changes. It may change as the inequality trends evolve, as social compositions evolve, and as educations improve. But there's these are all things that we're going to have to look at very specifically in the cases of each individual village. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. That's it.
Thank you, Pete, for a wonderful presentation spanning such a huge period. We now have Junaid Ahmed, who would be commenting on some of this work and I guess helping us place it in the context of broader developments. Junaid is the Vice President of Operations at the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, part of the World Bank Group. He was also the Country Director for World Bank in India for 5 years? Yeah, thank you. Junaid.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Poonam for inviting me to be part of this amazing conference, and particularly this session. So I asked myself, why would Poonam put me in this position? Right. To paraphrase Mark Twain, I never let statistics and data get in the way of good policy analysis. So why am I here to comment on such intensive and superb policy analysis? But let me try. First, Peter is spot on. I think we need to focus on statistics and surveys and understanding at the local level. We cannot just rely on national aggregate data. And Peter does a great job in explaining why. Clearly in India, the scale and diversity of India requires us to understand what's happening at the local level. You have demographic transitions, you have economic transitions in different parts of the country at different pace. Tamil Nadu is not Telangana, right? And you have to understand what's happening at the local level. And I think that the aggregate is not going to give us that sense. Second is you need this local variation to actually hold the national data accountable. You want to be able to test whether the national data is giving you the right story, and especially when the national data takes every decade to be released. Then it's extremely important that you have local data, and that's the point I'm going to stress on quite a bit in my comments. The third is inequality. I think Peter is quite right. To understand inequality, you really have to be at the local level. The discussion that I missed on son preference today, gender inequality within households cannot be understood at the aggregate level. You have to begin to really look at it at the local level. And I think the most important part of what I took away is this whole issue of structural transformation. I must admit, it was sort of back to the future. I had the honor of taking a graduate class with Hollis Chenery. And if anyone could tell you about structural transformation, it was Hollis. Structural transformation in India, indeed in South Asia, my own country, Bangladesh, is incomplete. And we need to understand what is happening in terms of structural transformation. In a context of where global shocks are increasing, structural transformation has to be understood at the local level. What's going to happen to agriculture? What's going to happen to non-farm jobs in a context of climate, pandemic, and technological shocks is going to vary between different parts of the country, but it certainly will be better understood at the local level. So, Peter, there's absolutely no doubt your point about the need for us to focus on local data, local surveys, and there are now tremendous innovation in terms of techniques and processes of which you have been an author of, Sonal has been an author of, and I think we need to rely on that quite a bit. But I want to focus on something you put in your first slide, in which you referred to the incredible statistical architecture and ecosystem of government of India. The question when I read your paper and I saw your presentation was, is India's statistical architecture or India's statistical ecosystem future ready? And this is where I think there has to be a serious discussion in this country whether the national statistical system is future ready. What's happening in terms of global trends, there are massive reforms in the statistical ecosystem. There's massive reforms in how data is collected, what type of data is collected, how data is presented, and how data ecosystem is governed. You take a look at UK. UK just went through a massive change in its statistical architecture about a decade ago because it felt that the governance of the statistical system was not strong. Mexico has gone through it. Brazil has gone through it. Australia has gone through it. Canada went from a traditional statistical department to create Stats Canada. Stats Canada, where you have a separation from government department, ministry, and the statistical agency. And you have actually a governance, a set of set of, if you will, civil society and government leaders who oversee the governance process, and every couple of years have an independent review of whether the statistics system is working. And I think that this is extremely important if we're going to be able to understand the type of change that happens in a country, especially in a country like India. And in the context of India, as long as this kind of governance change does not happen, very important to continue the local data gathering. You know, I fear, and with apologies to Mahalanobis, I fear that the Mahalanobis distance between the Indian statistical system as it stands today and what is needed is just growing exponentially. And I think this is something that needs to be addressed. If we thought that reform of DISCOMs was hard, let me tell you, reform of statistical systems is even harder across the world. My own experience, just before COVID hit, I went to the Ministry of Statistics. At the time I was country director of India, and I told the secretary that I'd like to put 25% of World Bank lending into the statistics reforms of India. I completely surprised the secretary. He did not expect such an offer. And the engagement that we got into landed up with a request of more computers and more studies, when actually we wanted to be a partner with the Statistics Ministry in completely taking India's statistical system forward. I think that this is something that, as I read your paper and I saw your power present and listened to you, I think that this is a very serious issue. And I think NCAER, Poonam, has to be the voice in which a rethink of the statistical system of India is promoted. And I know, Sonal, you're leading a team inside last time we spoke, and I thought that was a very, very important storyline. There's another context of the importance of local story. Is so much money is flowing into the local level, not only through social protection, the centrally sponsored scheme and so on. I mean, if you look at the statistics of how much money goes to the hands of a BDO, a block development officer, it is incredible, right? Do we have data to understand how that money is actually spent? Right? This is not going to be collected at the center level. This has got to be collected at the local level. And in many ways, the story of local statistics raises a very important point. What is the state capability of actually doing this kind of work? Because gathering the statistics at a local level is not going to be enough. It's how does it get translated into policy making? And does the capacity of state officials and state policymakers, and is the system able to take the data and put it inside state policy making? Odisha is a fascinating state, how they've actually begun to take local data straight into policy making. I think this kind of learning at the state level is something that we need to invest in. I'd really say that NCAER ought to be supporting this in a very big way. So it's a very different take I have on your paper. It's the best way for me to say that what you're putting on the table is extremely important, both for the political economy of the way statistics is collected, also for the way local trends really affect structural transformation. Now, I couldn't finish comments without just saying a few words about Peter. Peter was in the World Bank, and he was one of, I would say, the core economists that really mattered for us in terms of understanding poverty. And it was not only his intellectual work that made a difference, but the way he worked inside the World Bank was phenomenal. He was known as one of the most collaborative and supportive economists. So when he left, people realized that you don't replace a Peter Lanjouw, you try to follow in his footsteps. And I just hope that his trip to Netherlands is nothing more than one of these return migrations that will happen back to the World Bank. Peter, we do miss you.
Thank you, Junaid and Peter. It's been a great presentation and discussion, and I think there must be a lot of comments and questions in the audience. So we'll just take it there. Arvind and then Devesh.
So I want to go to my sort of favorite theme, which is, the migration of workforce from agriculture into industry and services, or from rural to urban areas. From the two village studies you have, and what I heard you say was that mainly these were people who will temporarily go work for maybe a few months, come back. Ultimately, for transformation to take place, there has to be permanent migration. At least some of it has to begin happening. Why is it that with 20 years of about 7% growth per year, this is just not happening? I mean, do your village studies throw any light, whatever, on that? Very quickly to Junaid, please send your experts to Gujarat. I have seen their statistical system. I was personally very impressed. But does it meet your standards? Is that something? Because if you got one or two states, then one can try to spread that. But some experts have to be looking at this. So that would be a helpful thing to do. One last thing, of course, when I left Niti Aayog, we had just started this aspirational districts program. And it is now going to the block level. So some of the pitch that you're making for, and Peter is making for as well, to do it at the local level, certainly is now beginning to happen. How well or not, how much assessment, what kind of assessment is happening, that I do not yet know, but certainly the government's effort has very much gone down to the district level. Now it is going to the block level.
Devesh?
Peter, we've been doing some work on structural transformation over the past 70 years. And one of the things we see is today, farm income is less than half of rural income. And in farm income, both livestock income and horticulture is more than cereals. But all the attention goes to cereals. And I was curious that even in your slide you had rice and wheat, but not the other sources of farm income. At an all India level, cereals is today actually number 3 as a source of farm income. And we pay, and what is interesting is all public policy, MSP, procurement is about a sector, cereals, which has grown much slower as a source of the structural change happening in farm income, whereas livestock and horticulture are much more market driven, much less relative government support. One question which I wanted to ask you in the case of Palanpur is if you could give us a sense of urban-rural linkages, given that Moradabad, the town, became India's sort of brass industry, big exporter. The roads sort of in that district, which I know a bit well, because I was sort of born in sort of Moradabad, so I have a sense of that place. That has really changed. And so much of this migration that goes to Moradabad to work in these factories, could you give us a sense of that urban-rural linkages? Because that's been another source, because that's one of the main sources of non-farm income that's been changing. And it's not the usual migration and remittances, because it's really people living in New Jersey go to work in New York, right?
it's at a local scale, this is what is happening. And if you could give us a sense of that.
We have several hands, so I'd like to just call upon them and then give you a chance to respond. Maitresh, Poonam, Govinda Rao, and Suman Berry.
Maybe a second round. I have a question.
Okay.
Whether this family is
Peter, a very nice presentation and very interesting comments. I have a somewhat nerdy question to ask, which is the following. I was puzzled by that mobility slide, and you also mentioned there's a puzzle there. So I was just thinking the fact that you have these different quintiles, right? And people, you know, the fact that those in the bottom, and if we just focus on the top, right? That the same family being in that is sort of, there seems to be mobility. People are moving out. Now from the top, you only go to the bottom, or not the very bottom, but down, and from the down, you can only go up. But then there's this intergenerational mobility, the elasticity, that is stagnant. If anything, it has increased. So one simple explanation for that could be just external migration. So those who remain, you know, they are kind of staying in similar occupations as their parents, so therefore that would explain that. But you're also saying that there's not a lot of external migration going on. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around almost to find the sort of corresponding statistical expressions that would explain both sets of facts. Thank you.
Poonam?
So Peter, a couple of observations / comments which relate to what Arvind and Devesh said. So, you know, a unique observation perhaps, you showed yields across rice, wheat and bajra, which is millet. Bajra's yield has increased by the least, and Indians are currently focusing a lot on millet production and consumption. So how will it square up with the overall data that you showed? Another was on the number of households that have increased in the sample. I assume that Palanpur is not the kind of place where a lot of families will move in. You can correct me if that's not wrong. So which means it's the same household is splitting into smaller households. So that's what's happening. Another one is a related one. So external migration may be small, but if it's the best and the brightest that move out, perhaps, you know, your initial sample ends up doing better, but it's not reflected in the sample as such. Final one, gender, is missing from your observations. So what's happening to the women in those households? Are they actually working, not working, on the farm, non-farm? What is happening to them? Thank you.
Dr. Govinda Rao.
Thank you. It's an excellent paper, very insightful, very useful. I think we need to go to the local sort of milieu. My comment is that this also has to do with some issues of migration. The village that you have chosen in Mandya district of Karnataka is a very well connected district, very well connected place to Bangalore. And it doesn't take much time to reach Bangalore. So obviously migration doesn't take place because to be in Bangalore is much more expensive. So it's always better to sort of, if you have every half an hour a bus coming from that place to Bangalore, there is no point in so you can't have, that's one. And the second thing is initial infrastructure and initial conditions in the village is much better than anywhere else you see. It's an irrigated place, and that's the reason why there is a lot of sugarcane growing, and obviously there are a lot more of opportunities for non-farm jobs as well. So if you go to Bidar or Gulbarga, in other places, things will be completely different. This is what I wanted to mention.
Thank you. Suman Berry.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Two of them.
Thanks, Peter. Brilliant. I just wanted to take this more forward. So firstly, having had the experience of living in your wonderful country for 4 years, I'd be interested to know what is the database that supports, as it were, decentralization down to the level of the gemeente in the Netherlands. And is it survey? Is it administrative data? So, if you look at a well-functioning, decentralized European country, what is the data that supports the delivery of public services, in the hope that that could be a prototype for what Arvind just mentioned. So yes, we are trying to take development down to the block level, and as Junaid has already indicated, I mean, there is the old image was of a hapless block development officer who was expected to deliver all the central schemes. That may or may not be the reality, but the issue is that what ought to be the data structure to support driving development down to the block level. That was my first question. My second question, and I don't want to think of COVID as a natural experiment, but as we look ahead, the issue of resilience, particularly in respect of adaptation, but even with respect to other shocks, and you talk about shocks, becomes central. So how would you say your research over so many years relates to some of the stylizations we had from the ICRISAT study about communities reacting to, and given the fact that we do now have the capacity for service delivery as represented by the ration data that you had and that Surjit exploited in his paper on pre-transfer and post-transfer. So the question really is, what should the state or states be doing to strengthen resilience? And third, again, I think, was it Poonam? So the commitment of the Prime Minister is to women-led development. My expectation is that in Palanpur, I don't know that much about the South, that actually most women leave their parental home, and that is a large part of the permanent migration that Arvind was talking about. So what does that, as a sociological reality, mean for women-led development? What are the points of intervention in their birthplace, in where they move to, and is it a question of legislation, or so how is it that these realities can support women-led development, and then whatever that means for the labor force participation of women?
Thank you. I'll give Surjit the last question, and then Pete has pretty large set of questions and diverse questions to respond to.
I just want to make, I think, 3 comments. First, I think we all agree that data administration should be outside of the purview of the government. In the beginning, it was essential that the government be involved. Now it is essential that the government not be involved. So that part, complete agreement. Second, again, which is the thrust of your thing and Junaid's comments, data and TN's, if you will, legacy. Data quality is critical for any analysis / interpretation, and especially policy recommendations. Now, I didn't get a chance to, I did have the paper, but I was working on Ruchi's paper. So, but a couple of things came up from your presentation. One about, and I guess I'm expected to speak about poverty going up despite a lot of income, and you had said despite a lot of income growth, and I'll be more specific in a minute. And you said that, look, the 2015 or 2022 or whatever, that the poverty line that you use was the Rangarajan line, and it'd be very useful to have a consistent same line over time, so we could and it could be any line, but it should be consistent over time, because I think this is a very rich data set that we could, all of us could benefit from. Now on Karnataka, and excuse me because the slides were going, so if I've misinterpreted, my deepest apologies, but I was trying to take down what you show in Karnataka, that income went up by something like 30–40%, and inequality went down and poverty went up. I do not know of any place in history that you have, now you try to give an explanation, but really I'm trying to, and the point is the income increase is substantial, 40–50%, and your inequality decline is also substantial, and your poverty increase is also substantial. So I would say I have yet to see any set of numbers anywhere in the world, including, mind you, the closest one it comes to is the 2017-18 survey. The 2017-18 survey with one big difference. The 2017-18 survey, the much derided, justifiably survey, but I won't go that path. The 2017-18 survey showed that inequality had declined more than ever in Indian history. At the same time, incomes or consumption had declined more than any time in Indian history. So that was, so everybody became poorer. So I think that fits. Your thing, I'm afraid, doesn't fit. Thanks.
Thank you. Peter, please.
Well, thank you so much for these comments, and Junaid, thank you so much for your very kind words. It's, I mean, I miss the World Bank very much as well, so it was really good of you to say that. Arvind, the question about the migration of workers, I mean, I think and this also relates to Devesh's comment, and I think Poona, you raised this as well. In Palanpur, the migration, there's been, obviously, as Suman mentioned, there is this very established tradition of the women marrying and leaving the village and joining the family of their husbands. So that's a form of migration which is definitely there. But in terms of migration for work, it's very much of a daily commuting basis, along the lines of what Devesh and Poona were mentioning. Not so much migrating away for 6 months or a year. That does happen. There are cases of that, but that's not the, by and large, that's not the bulk of the migration that's going on. And what we have is this really interesting process of, it might be specific to this part of India, but my understanding is it's a very densely populated part of India. It's very very large, very populous region, and there's just very many small towns. There's the big cities like Moradabad, but for Palanpur, Moradabad's one source of employment, but there's even other towns that are more closely located, and there's villagers that go and they work on a regular daily basis in the village and return to Palanpur in the evening. They keep some family members involved in agriculture potentially. They certainly keep their land. They might lease out some of their land, but they have some claim still to agriculture as well if they need to. So it's part of this resilience question that Suman brought up. Part of the resilience of households, I think, and I think it's really come home to them as a result of the COVID pandemic, is that they want to have this diversified set of activities and sources of income. But a very big part of the process in the Palanpur context, and I think this is true also for the Alabujanahalli region, because as Govinda mentioned, it's a very developed area. There's a small town only 2 kilometers away from Alabujanahalli. There's the Mandya, the district center, which is 25 kilometers away. There's Bangalore, which is 95 kilometers away. So it's very accessible to find work in a nearby locality and return to the village. And it's interesting because this resonates, I think, with an interesting paper that you may have seen by Martin Ravalian and colleagues written some years back, where they were arguing that small town development is really important for rural poverty reduction. And I think this is a key possible policy implication of this, is these development of small towns is a really important part of the strategy for dealing with rural poverty. So it's like this, you need to marry urban policy with rural objectives, because it can have these implications. This commuting is a really important thing. And if you think about small towns, it's interesting. I have done a little bit of work when I was still at the World Bank, where we looked at, let's look at per capita availability of things like hospitals, or per capita availability of lighting, or per capita availability of any number of publicly provided services, and then let's compare small towns with large cities. And then you'll find that despite their very large size, the large cities have a much higher per capita availability of all kinds of infrastructure services than these small towns do. They actually are somewhat neglected, they're somewhat sort of abandoned. And so there's a potential policy implication there, that if we could improve and galvanize, in some sense, economic activities in these small towns, that could have a huge payoff also in terms of rural poverty because of the employment it generates and so on. Now, with respect to Puna's point on women, I don't see in the Palanpur example a lot of women participating in that kind of commuting process. We have seen some expansion or some increase over the years in the number of women who are working outside of their home, working usually as part of a team, often low caste women working part of a team on, say, a brick kiln or some kind of project alongside their other family members, where it's paid on a sort of piece rate basis and so on. So we do see some increase in that kind of economic activity of women, but not so much in the form of this commuting and this employment in the nearby towns and so on. That might change, I don't know. But that whole issue of the commuting and the integration, the linkage between the village and the small nearby towns, I think is something that's really quite important and may potentially point to useful policy interventions, opportunities, particularly if you take into account the sort of the infrastructure deficits that exists in these areas. Junaid, you made this interesting point about the BDO, and we need to understand what they're doing and why we need to have local information. I would say I agree with that point, but I also think the BDO might really benefit from having some information about what's going on in his block in order to be able to decide where the priorities are. And there could be several villages, and they could be very different in terms of what their needs are. So from both sides, that local level information could be important. Devesh, you mentioned what are some of these other non-cereal crops. And in Palanpur, there's a very interesting example. It's kind of an up and down, very much along the lines of the Bill Easterly study of a sort of explosion of cultivation of menta, which is a key ingredient for chewing gum. And it turns out that Chandosi, that little town that near Palanpur, is kind of the world centers for the trade and the harvest and the cultivation of menta. And Palanpur got heavily involved in that, and lots of the villagers switched out of their other crops and started growing that crop as a cash crop, and did really well with it for a while. But then menta prices are governed by world prices, and they move in all kinds of directions. And at one point the menta prices were high, and it was like a great bargain. And then the next thing you knew, the menta prices had collapsed for factors totally unexpected to the Palanpur farmers, and suddenly they were in a real pickle. And so they've now abandoned the cultivation of menta again, or at least to a considerable extent. There is still some cultivated, but that's an example of they're very responsive to possible market signals and so on, and they do shift in and out. Regarding bajra cultivation, the millet cultivation, it's a crop that is grown in Palanpur. I don't think it has benefited to the same degree as sort of new seed varieties and so on as rice and cereal have had, and it hasn't benefited as much from that perspective. But of course it has benefited from the expansion of irrigation that took place, and presumably also the mechanization that is increasingly underway in Palanpur. So it remains a crop of some importance, but it's not the main cash crop in the village. Let me think. Maitresh, you had brought up this point about the mobility slide, and it is a little bit of a subtle, kind of complicated process of what we observe. One important thing to acknowledge is that right away when I was talking about intragenerational mobility, I was talking about relative mobility, this movement across quintiles, and then when we move to the intergenerational mobility, we're looking at the elasticity of incomes between father and son. So that relative dimension is not there, and we're not looking at it with exactly the same lens, and so that's one issue. And in terms of migration, I mean, I think you're right that there is, probably some of the most successful villagers have possibly moved out of the village. And there's one anecdote that I could mention, one aspect of migration that has been quite important in Palanpur that we document in the book, which is that there is one subcaste in the village community called the Pasis that actually moved into the village in the 1950s, before the first survey took place. So they had come from elsewhere, they had moved into the village, they were in the village for a certain period of time, and then they left the village again, so that by 1993 there were far fewer of them. So they were the one example of people moving into the village and then moving out again as a group to the largest extent. There's hardly any Pasis left in the village now. And at the time they were very involved in non-agricultural activities. They were the best connected to the outside world. And you could imagine that perhaps those connections and those relations that they had outside the village also made it easier for them to leave the village altogether. And that may well be a consequence of this further diversification of the rural economies, that it may make it easier for some villagers to decide that their best option is to actually leave the village. So we may, going forward, if we collect more data over the years, we may actually see quite significant trends along those lines. It's something we'll have to wait and see. Govinda, you mentioned how Mandya district is very, very particular, and in some sense it's the counterintuitive finding that I get out of that is that while Alabujanahalli is this really well-connected district, it's also irrigated and actually has a lower extent of non-farm diversification than Palanpur does. And it's actually consistent with what Scarlett Epstein had found in that same district when she had studied her two villages, that the village that becomes really focused on agriculture ends up staying more traditional and remains sort of more cultivation oriented, whereas the village that doesn't benefit from the irrigation and the opportunities then diversifies, out of necessity, presumably. But so the Alabujanahalli is in a very fertile area, has good land, good access to irrigation and so on, and has remained heavily focused on sugarcane cultivation. There is 30% of the workforce is employed outside the village, but that's considerably less than what we see in Palanpur, and they seem to be more selective in terms of the kind of opportunities that they go for. They don't go for the sort of informal, casual, non-farm employment opportunities. They're more choosy, and they wait till they have a regular non-farm job in Bangalore or in Mandya, and then they actually choose to go that route. So it seems to be an interesting difference between Palanpur and Alabujanahalli, just emphasizing again how the experience of the different villages is going to be very different as a function of the conditions and the circumstances of the district and the region and so on. Suman, you made this very interesting question about what kind of data infrastructure do we need to be able to really get at this local level information. Well, the Netherlands is a little bit like the Nordic countries in this regard, in the sense that, at my university, we have a dedicated terminal, and we can actually access, we have to ask permission from the Central Statistical Office, which is quite independent from the government. We can get permission to actually analyze the unit record administrative data that the Netherlands collects, which is basically data on everything that you could possibly imagine available at the level of individuals. I mean, I literally get messages from my municipality telling me when I have to send my children to the dentist, because it's time for them to have their dental appointment, because they know and they're tracking what the time is when my children need to go to the dentist. Information on incomes are available, and you can juxtapose them with information on household characteristics and composition, and you can juxtapose it with occupations and so on, and you can do analysis at the level of any level that you would like. And so you can go online, and you can also just click and produce maps very much along the lines of what I showed. all anonymized. Yeah. You never have access to the identity of the individuals, but you can produce the maps that I was showing for Andhra Pradesh, Orissa, and West Bengal. Very, at a few clicks, you can produce that in the Netherlands. This is something that can also be done in the Nordic countries: Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland. Turns out you can also do it in Estonia, and you can also do it in Slovenia. So there are a few countries where this administrative infrastructure has been put in place, and these data are made available at a very, very disaggregated level, and users can have access these data. Sometimes if it's a real deep research project, you need to get special permission. But if you go on the Estonian Statistical Office website, it's unbelievable how much detailed information you can just, as anybody can just produce at the very, very local level, providing a wealth of information for both government as well as researchers. So that kind of information, that kind of infrastructure can be achieved. How easy is that to do, and how easy would it be to do in a country like India with its enormous size? I mean, I'm a little bit less well placed to judge that, but I do think that there is experience out there in how to produce that kind of data infrastructure.
Helping us in meeting, but the real question is, what are quality checks on administrative data? So that becomes then the core issue, okay? Because I mean, a lot of our stunting and wasting and other data is coming out of administrative data, and the question of whether that's reliable, whether what the Anganwadi worker is actually inputting, etc. So I think that there's a cascade of issues. There's the issue of what should you be using surveys for, what should you be using administrative data for, what is good for monitoring. But the quality of administrative data becomes, I think, as important as the issue of the quality of survey data.
I think quality is extremely important. Of course, the nice thing about going down to the very local level is that the data become democratic, right? You can actually look yourself at your community, and you can start looking at some of the information that's in the system about your locality, which you may actually know a lot about, and you can start pointing out when there's big clear errors in the data that are being reported by the statistical office for your particular block or neighborhood or something like that.
That's a journey we need to go on.
I beg your pardon?
I said that's a journey we need to go on.
Because then it's really from there that you want to then aggregate up to the national level, right? If everybody's able to check at the very local level as to what kind of information is going into the system, then when you then aggregate it up, you also have a better chance of hoping that the national picture that you have is the correct one. Resilience, I think the diversification story that I was emphasizing, I think is one of the best ways that the villagers can sort of diversify their portfolio and therefore be able to weather the different types of shocks that could hit them. So I think that's a really important one, and the kind of policy entry point might be along the lines of what I was saying, which is to encourage that kind of diversification process so that those opportunities are available to not just a subset of the village population, but to the broader community. Women-led development, I'm afraid I don't have a whole lot more to say beyond what I already mentioned in response to Puna's question. Surjit, I think the points that you made were very interesting and valid. I mean, it's true that I reported the Rangarajan poverty line poverty estimate for 2022. Even if I had used the Tendulkar poverty line, which is the one I had used for the earlier poverty estimates, I still would have been very reluctant to compare that poverty rate to the earlier poverty numbers, because the poverty income measure that we were using against that poverty line is very, very different. It's a very simple recall-based measure of income that we have for the 2022 survey round, compared to a very carefully checked and verified income measure that we have for the other rounds of data.
Just don't report the 22.
Yeah, we should definitely not have. I should not have reported that poverty number. I did apologize, but I should not have done that. On Karnataka, the story in Karnataka, when I first saw it, I just couldn't understand it either. But I have been able to convince myself that there is a story that makes sense if you kind of follow that explanation that I follow, which is you had this SC community, which was a small 10%, 15% segment of the village population. They were at the bottom of the income distribution originally, and they were able to do quite well in securing non-farm jobs. So their incomes increased and their poverty declined. At the same time, there was a large segment of the village population that was involved in agriculture, and a subset of those agricultural households were really hit by rising cultivation costs, so that their real incomes fell. That doesn't mean to say that all of the cultivation households saw their real incomes fall, but there's a subset of the households that had seen their real income, did see the real incomes fall. So they fell into poverty. So we have some of the poor leaving poverty and some new poor, and then it's a relative issue of the relative frequency, relative number of whether more fell back into poverty or more left poverty. And that's so one way of kind of squaring that circle. The one additional point I possibly should have mentioned that kind of helps me believe my story is that if you look at the squared poverty gap, which is the poverty gap which is more sensitive to the extreme poverty outcomes, that actually declined over this time period rather than rose. So it's really a question of the head count rate, where people cross that threshold. There's more people landing into the falling into the class of poor, while perhaps some of the poor became less poor along the squared poverty gap dimension. It's a tortured logic, but it's the only way that I could understand what happened there. But it is very, very unique. I had never seen anything like that in my life before either.
Thank you, Peter. Both Junaid and I have 30-second comments, and then we would ask everyone to join us for the tea outside. To follow up on your conversation about commuter migration and to link it to women-led development, the NCER IHDS data, what we found was that in the villages which gained transportation infrastructure, there was a much greater movement of women into non-farm work than that of men. So there is something to the commuter-led employment opportunities. Much of our migration story tends to focus on permanent migration or circular migration, but commuter migration we haven't paid enough attention to. Okay, Junaid?
On this issue of migration, the traditional migration literature says person X leaves the village to go to the city, finds a job, tries to find a job. What we have found, it's the labor market that really showed us this, is that migration is a family decision, and people are placed in one part of the country versus other for income diversification. So this linkage to the village remains. So your point is exactly right. I think the shift to permanent migration will be if there's a sense of lowering of risks that people feel. Right now, people are extremely sensitive to shocks, and therefore they pool income and they place family members in different parts of the migration in order to pool income. There's a lot of literature on that. In fact, there's an incredible paper by Odette Stark looking at weddings and how far a woman gets married and moves from the family is related to income shocks and correlations of income shocks. So it's a fascinating story. One final point: this whole issue of small towns and rural productivity there's a whole literature on this, and Latin America is the place where this linkage was shown to be the strongest.
Thank you everyone, and tea awaits us.